The reason that this recommendation is brought forth is that the Commission believes that the original intent of having ex officio members of this body be voting members is that they were, from the beginning, all elected officials, including the clerk and the treasurer. But current day practice here in Brattleboro, and no disrespect intended whatsoever, is that the clerk and treasurer are not elected by the people and therefore not representative in the strictest sense of that term, whereas all of the other ex officio members, be it select board members, state representatives, and of course the representative town meeting members, are indeed elected and therefore should have the rights that a voting member has. Now, that does not preclude the clerk or treasurer, should they be members of this body separately, from voting, but only the office of treasurer or clerk.
Question is, shall the town clerk and town treasurer be non-voting members of representative town meeting? Are you ready for that question? Mr. Burrill.
I'd like to raise a question which, Mr. Moderator, you may choose to rule me out of order in raising this question at this moment under this article. But it seems to me that it's closely related enough so that it is germane to our current consideration. And that is the service of our town manager as a member of this body, a voting member. No offense intended towards Ms. Sontag, but in working on the pay-as-you-throw issue this past summer, I quite accidentally stumbled upon a provision under Title 17, and quite frankly, at the moment, I don't remember the section number, but I'm sure Mr. O'Connor and Mr. Fisher do recall it, which simply says, it's a statute that's entitled Incompatible Offices. And as I was flipping through, the only sentence I noticed in that rather lengthy statute was this one sentence: a town manager shall not hold an elective office in the town or town school district. It's that simple and that clear. Now, the distinction between the article we're now considering is the issue raised by Mr. Block was the town clerk and the town treasurer are not elected. But here, and in this instance, the town manager has been elected as a representative in March of 2008. But by state statute, she would be prohibited from acting as an elected official in this body. Now, I know what Mr. Fisher is going to say is we have the provision under Article 2, Section 4, which says that our charter takes precedence over state statute. But I think that's an arguable issue because our town charter does not have a provision entitled and dealing with the more specific subject of incompatible offices. So I would just simply ask this body to discuss and consider, along with the town clerk issue and the town treasurer issue, the issue of our town manager serving as a non-voting member. I understand there's some slight distinctions there, but I think we've got to consider that because our state legislature has perhaps very appropriately gleaned a problem with a town manager serving an elected position. She serves, number one, the Board of Selectmen, and I shouldn't even be using gender in this presentation because any town manager would naturally feel some pressure from the board that butters their bread, let's face it, and might not be willing to risk their job for the sake of their constituent. And I think that's what's at the bottom of the state statute. So I raise that as a question, perhaps. I'm not offering it as an amendment at this moment, but I think it's something we've got to consider. I've also learned from people in the know that Mr. Fisher has now re-advised Ms. Sontag on this very issue. I raised it with the moderator last summer on a couple of occasions, and I never heard a response. But what I'm understanding now is that Ms. Sontag will not run for election again because we're too close to the line, and that Mr. Fisher has so advised her not to. But I think maybe we ought to incorporate that into this motion. I also, and I don't feel strongly about this, but I think in a technical sense, perhaps Ms. Sontag should not be voting on these articles today. Thank you.
Question is on Article 12, whether or not the town clerk or the town treasurer should be non-voting members. Ms. Sunday.
Couple, just to respond to that. Prior to running for the office, I checked with the town clerk and the town attorney to see if I could run for office, and I was told I could, and that was back in 2008. So just to let you know that. With regard to Mr. Burrell's knowledge of a conversation that I had with Attorney Fisher via phone, I'm interested in how he knew about that, but that's, I guess, a separate point, but I think this is also a separate point. And with regard to feeling pressure of the board to vote for my constituents, you will have noticed that I have not voted, that I voted several different times. I've been the only one standing up on different items. So I take, I have made the decision not to run for a town representative at the upcoming elections. I, just as I think everyone else in this room, takes probably great privilege and pride in serving the people I represent, and I probably do it with a lot of knowledge. So I would offer that. I would also state then at this point that I'm not sure that Mr. Burrell's comments are germane to the article.
Mr. Agavi.
The issue of ex officios was discussed at the Charter Commission, and it was in terms of why should any ex officios have a vote, that there was, for much like Mr. Burrell was explaining, there was inherent conflicts of interest. And I mean, no doubt nobody feels like they have one. In particular, the town clerk and the town treasurer were singled out, not because the commission had any particularly strong feelings for those two, but it seemed like it was natural and appropriate to include them because, as we will see in a little while, there is a recommendation that they will speak to in which their status or their position in town will shift from being ratified by town meeting to simply being hired by the town manager, and they will be sort of officially just department heads. And our question was, well, why should those two department heads have a vote at town meeting and not all of them? And eventually we shrugged and said, well, let's let the town meeting members decide for themselves why they may or may not want ex officios to vote and why some would be singled out as special and others not.
Question is on Article 12. Mr. Everett.
Mr. Moderator, Dart Everett, District 3. I would amend that motion to say, if appointed by the town manager. Because if we defeat this, then the town clerk would run for office, and therefore I would have a different opinion. But if appointed by the town manager, I can see the justification for it.
Is there a second? Second. Motion has been made and seconded to amend the article to read, the town clerk and the town treasurer will be non-voting members of the town representative meeting if appointed by the town manager. Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor signify by standing until counted. You may be seated. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. And you've adopted the amendment proposed by Mr. Everett. The recurring question now is, shall you adopt the amended article that the town clerk and town treasurer will be non-voting members of the representative town meeting if appointed by the town manager? I'm sorry. Yes, sir, I'm sorry. I can't see you. Okay.
Chris Chapman, District 1. Could we interrogate the town attorney on the point that was brought up by the gentleman who recently spoke on the issue, this Title 17? Is that his interpretation?
Mr. Fisher is interrogated.
That we have revisited our opinion 2 years ago. Looking at the charter, we were of the opinion that the town manager, being a resident, could run to be a town meeting member. Mr. Burrill, in pointing that out and studying that more recently, when the issue has come up as to whether Ms. Sondag would run again, we have reversed our opinion, indicating that that state statute, which is specific to a town manager shall not hold an elective office. It doesn't define what type of office, but being a town meeting member, we think is now a sufficient office to say that it would be more proper for Ms. Sondag not to run.
Question is on Article 12, town clerk and town treasurer shall be non-voting members of the representative town meeting if appointed by the town manager. Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor kindly stand. Remain standing until counted. Those opposed kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The ayes have it, and you've adopted Article 12. Article 13, the chair recognizes Mr. Pillsbury.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the town approve amendment to the non-binding initiative process. Whoops. I may be a little off on that. Why don't we try going to this one? I move that all votes on the issuance of bonds, the representative town meeting newspaper ballots containing the warrant question and including a line whereon the member shall print his or her name so that a permanent record of such votes can and shall be kept by the town clerk. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Is there a second? Motion has been made and seconded, as stated by Mr. Pillsbury. Mr. Block.
I'd like to turn this discussion to be led by Mr. Orion Barber, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Orion Barber, District 1. Currently, our practice is to, by state statute, our practice in authorizing the issuance of municipal bonds is by Australian ballot. So this is no change as far as that is concerned. However, you will note in the rules for town meeting, which is Appendix Appendix B, I believe, it says that all votes shall be by standing, division, or roll call. The obvious intent there is so that the public in the districts in town can know how their reps voted. Well, historically, the members of the public have never been able to know how their reps voted on a bond issue. And bond issues cost a lot of tax money. So it seemed to us that it made sense, since we are representing the members of our districts, that we don't get a secret, an ultimately secret ballot. We would sign our ballots. The town clerk would continue to keep our ballots so that the bond bank would continue to be happy in the knowledge that the town indeed had voted bonded indebtedness. And if anybody wanted to know whether I indeed voted for a bond issue that would replace pumper number 4, because I want to make damn sure that my 150-year-old house doesn't go up in smoke before the central firehouse can get there, they can find that out. So as representatives of our districts, we, I believe, are not entitled to a secret ballot, even on a bond issue. But we are meeting all requirements of state law as far as the authorization of bonded indebtedness.
Question is on Article 13. Mr. DeGray.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The part that really confuses me, and if you were here on Wednesday evening, if you want to know how I voted for a $35,000 dump truck, because we're going to bond, and then we're voting on a $14.5 million budget with a standing count, seems a little bit, what's the important issue here? If you're talking about dollar amounts and accountability, then the school budget, the town school budget, and our budget should be by roll call. And when I made that point the other evening, they said, well, and it was a time issue. Well, if you want accountability, time is not the issue. If you want someone to see how I voted on a $14 or a $15 million budget, and that number is going to go up every year, sadly, then, and you want somebody to go in and see how I voted on that issue, there should be a record of that. That's the important issue. This year we're going to be voting on a $400,000 fire truck. That's not chump change, and I don't disagree with Orion's saying that we should have some sort of record. But let's keep our eye on the ball. No one is really going to the town office to say, how did Dick DeGray vote for that $50,000 truck? The issue is, if you want to have accountability, then let's have accountability and do the roll call vote, or make an motion and do it by division where people are counted. You stand there, we stand up for these votes, and we're expecting the camera, as it pans us, to give the people who are watching on TV, oh, how did they vote? Well, there's some of us who are height challenged, and some of us that the camera doesn't pick up. There really isn't a record of us when we're doing our votes. We like to think we're doing that. The only thing that it helps is the moderator, in reality, with the division. If it looks close, or somebody calls, they say, well, that looks close. But as for a record, the truth of the matter is you should do roll calls. And this here, me signing that, now, again, I'm not opposed to it, but the reality is the big ticket item, which is the budget for the town school and us, we have no record of how you vote. And very rarely do people go and say, well, I'm running for select board because you voted for that $35,000 dump truck.
Question is on Article 13, which adds the language that a member shall print his or her name on the Australian ballot. Mr. Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Chuck Cummings, District 1. I'd like to inquire of Town Council whether or not a ballot cast unsigned under the Australian ballot voting would not be counted.
Mr. Fisher's interrogated.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. An unsigned ballot, as it is now, is counted by all means. Does that answer?
That's not the question.
Oh, if this were passed, I thought you were asking right now.
No,
Okay.
no. I'm aware of the fact that Australian ballots are not signed.
If this is passed and there is an unsigned ballot, then theoretically that would not be counted.
I don't see that anywhere in the charter. And I don't know what you base your opinion on.
If you're requiring that each town meeting member shall legibly print his or her name so that each representative's vote can be counted and retained on all bond issuance actions, which is the proposed language, if you look at the proposed charter, that would be in there. And I believe it was mentioned the other night with regard to whether or not, if this passes, the question was of Vermont Bond Counsel, Paul Giuliani, would this be accepted by the Vermont Municipal Bond Bank? And his opinion is yes, because this is ultimately an act of the legislature. I'm not saying whether it should be passed or not, shouldn't be passed, but that was of grave concern, that we don't want to be passing something that would not be accepted by the bond bank.
I realize you're not taking sides. It would appear to me that if we pass this and require the name to be placed on the ballot, there is perhaps undue consideration given to how a person votes, and maybe the town manager has a thought.
Town manager. Oh,
Attorney Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Much of this debate has to do with the difference between Australian ballot, which by definition is a secret ballot. So the question that you're raising is, if you have to sign your name to it, is that going to affect the way somebody votes? Is it going to be some undue pressure that exerts some sort of adverse will over somebody's vote? That I don't think I can answer as far as a legal issue. That's the part of the policy decision that you'd be making in either approving this recommendation or not.
It would be a consideration taken by the firm or the person who bought the bonds from the bond bank, and in the past they wanted it done by Australian ballot so that they could be sure that the town did it voluntarily. I don't think we're going to satisfy that, and I would suggest that we not adopt this.
Question is on Article 13.
Well, if I can,
Yes.
if I just in
Mr.
responding
Fisher.
to Mr. Cummings, comment there. That's why the Charter Commission and Town Council had asked Vermont Bond Council to look into that. So I can't tell you whether the investors buying the Vermont bonds are going to say no to these because of it being, it's still an Australian, it's a paper ballot. See, it gets into whether it's the definition of Australian ballot. If this is approved, this is going to be Vermont's law as to how Brattleboro adopts municipal bonding issues. So if that is legal, then theoretically the sale of these bonds should have no impediments on the market.
I respectfully disagree with bond counsel, and I don't know what he took into consideration, but I think he's wrong, and I don't think we should adopt this.
Mr. Barber.
For what it's worth, I'll read you Paul Giuliani's response when I sent him the language of our proposed amendment. And here's what he said. I don't see any legal problem with this additional step in the bond authorization process. The intention is not to replace the existing authorization provisions in the Charter or in the general law. This is meant to be more a procedural step than a substantive one. If the General Assembly hasn't a problem revising the Charter accordingly, there will be no adverse effect on the town's ability to authorize bonded indebtedness.
Mr. Everett.
Dart Everett, District 3. I assume then, as we are filling out these ballots, someone from the town clerk's office would have to be observing, ensuring that we put down our own names and not somebody else's names. And to me, that is a form of intimidation. No harm meant to the people who would be doing it, but to me, there's some intimidation there if somebody's watching over my shoulder as I vote.
Question is, on Article 13, Mr. Beatty.
When individuals vote, there is a purpose for secret balloting. If I'm voting for myself, then it makes sense. If I have to do it publicly, there can be intimidation. But we're representative members. We each represent, I don't know, dozens, 100 people. And those people need to have access to our vote. Just like when somebody's in a Congress or a Senate and they're voting, their votes are public. So I think it's entirely consistent with that logic that this be open. Now, Mr. DeGray suggests that we should do this with some other issues, and he perhaps has a point, and I think perhaps there should be another article at some point that we consider. But that's the only argument that I've heard that seems to me to be pertinent against this. Like, if we do it for this, we should do it for everything. Well, maybe we should, but it seems that we could do it for this. It's no big deal. It won't take a lot of time. And it will enable the public to have more access to what town meeting members do, and therefore it will make town meeting a more significant thing because you'll have to stand up for your decisions. Thank you.
Questions on Article 13, Mr. Miller.
Roger Miller, District 3. Sometimes well-intended things that we do have consequences of which we're not immediately aware. I would like to question, excuse me, the town clerk. Should we adopt this article? Let me follow through on the process. I would cast my vote, I would sign my name, I would put it in a box where nobody else can see it, and then when you count it, do you have to have a checklist? And you go down and you say, oh, Roger Miller voted this way, and so you check it off. In other words, I think that what we're doing is we're creating a lot of extra work. Or is it the intent of the motion just to collect these, and if anybody questions it or wants to see how did I vote, then they would thumb through all of the votes. How is the process going to work, and how much extra time are we adding to the voting process?
The town clerk's interrogated.
Well, from my understanding from the commission, I think the intent is that the results get put in the minutes. So we would, I don't think anybody would be watching over you while you're voting. I think what would happen is when the vote is over, we take the ballots back to the office, and when we're doing our minutes, we would have to go through the ballots and check off who voted which way, and it would be in the minutes. State law requires us to keep those ballots for 90 days, and then they would be destroyed after that. So your original ballots would be gone after 90 days, but I think the intent of the commission is that the record be there permanently, and so they have requested that it be in the town minutes. Does that answer your question? How much time? Staff time? An hour? 2 hours? Probably not more than that, I wouldn't think. I would think that would be max.
Question is on Article 13. Mr. Carlton.
Steve Carlton, District 3. You've talked a lot about the legality of it in lawyer fashion. I still don't quite understand if state statute requires Australian ballot. How does that reconcile with the charter not requiring it to be in secret or abrogating that secrecy? That's separate from the issue of bond vote. This is a legal issue between the two.
Mr. Fisher's interrogated.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Let me try to hit that a different way. You heard where Mr. Barber read Mr. Giuliani's response to him, in which he said that this would be an addition to what's required by state statute, so that it's an extra step in the procedure. Compare that to another way of getting to the intent that the Charter Commission is looking at, as far as, okay, standing up and being counted and having some record of how you voted on these large capital improvements. Another way to do that would be to say, okay, we'll change the charter, which ultimately is a state statute, to say that for the town of Brattleboro, bonding issues shall be voted on by a standing vote or a roll call or something like that. And while that would be a state statute, that creates almost more of a conflict between the charter as a statute and the statute on bonds, which requires it to be by Australian ballot. The form of the ballot is prescribed in the actual statute. So I think in Mr. Giuliani is not here, but I think part of his opinion goes to it's easier to have an additional step than to have an entirely different way of voting on bonding issues in Brattleboro compared to what the statute says for the rest of the state. So here we would be continuing to the ballots, the form of the articles, all would be as prescribed by statute. It's just the extra step of having to sign your name to it.
As Chuck Cummings says, he disagrees with that take on it, which I think is certainly one of those legal questions. And we can't answer it, but clearly there's obfuscation, not obfuscation, but disagreement about that. What I would say is that we have worked very hard, a lot of it is the pushing of dart, to stand up and be counted, whether you call that intimidation or not, to stand up in front of the camera and on our votes on everything that we do. Dart, you recommended that years ago, and the select board does it. It actually, I could never tell who was voting yay, who was voting nay. I can now. So I think that's intimidation, but the reality is we're also representatives and we're responsible to them for the choices we make. Years ago, I served on the Planning Commission when there was a lot of development activity and pressure. And we often would go into executive decision, as we had the legal right to do, to discuss something. I remember David Chase writing an article in the Reformer Weekly from this corner or something like that. And when he talked about one of our choices one time, it had to do with us going into the executive session, discussing it, which we had the legal right to do, but then coming out to make the vote in public. He said, my old mother always said to me, there's a lot of things that you can do in private and legally that you shouldn't necessarily do. He said, I remember the words to this day, it was neither necessary nor wise. And I really took those to heart. We're representatives. We certainly could broaden it, Dick, and find some way that still is time efficient and work efficient to broaden and extend that representativeness to people in a larger way. But it seems to me this is a movement, a motion, if it's legal, in that direction, and we could even extend it further. They have a right to know what we do.
Question is on Article 13. Mrs. Stuckey.
Lee Stuckey, District 3. I sort of hesitate to speak because some of my points have already been made by Bob Beatty and by Steve Carlton, but I raised this question many years ago when I became a town meeting member, and it seemed very odd to me that we were able to cast a vote as the representative of other people, and it was completely secret. And I don't think there's any other place in local or state or national government where that is the case. So there seem to be a lot of objections raised to taking this step, which I thank the Commission for coming up with, the idea of signing a ballot. It seems to me it's at least a step in the direction of some kind of transparency, even if it means people have to go to the municipal center to look at the ballots, or maybe, as Annette says, the votes will be listed in, you know, in the minutes of the meeting. Is that a correct understanding? Anyway, I think without taking this step, we're still stuck in what is a really untenable position, in my view, and that is representing people without any kind of public exposure to how we voted.
Question is on Article 13, Mr. Eaton.
There are many comments being made that are very worthwhile, but I would like, just for my own edification, for someone to explain to me why, historically, it's been required that this be on an Australian ballot. If everyone speaking seems to want it to be open and recorded by the membership, it seems to me historically, for some reason or another, for this type of issue, it's to be a secret ballot. So I'd just like an explanation where that came from.
Mr. Fisher is interrogated.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'll take a stab at that. I think historically, with regard to bond votes, the idea is that if you're dealing with issues, and generally bond votes tend to be larger dollar items, that the secrecy of the vote would serve such that there's no impediment to anybody voting. So you vote, you can vote your conscience and not have to do that in public. So it goes to the secrecy of it. I think, unless other people can feel free to correct me, that that is part of the intent of the Australian ballot for bonds. And that is here juxtaposed to the idea of a representative form of government. And that's where the two collide.
Mr. Phillips.
Right, I said that before.
Thank you, Steve Phillips, District 3. I think this is a solution to a problem that doesn't really exist, so I'm inclined to not support this item. I am concerned about the legitimacy of our bonds. What a drastic result if Paul Giuliani turns out to be wrong. And who is he anyway? Is he our attorney? Did we pay him? Is he going to buy our bonds if they don't sell? I don't think so. So my concern is this, that I've done this, I don't know, 12, 13, 14, 15 years. And we live in a small town where people talk to each other and trust each other for the most part. If anyone had ever asked me in any of those years how I voted on a bond issue, I'd be more than happy to tell them. And I would remember. But nobody's bothered to ask me. They've asked me about other things, pay as you throw. And I talk to a lot of people on the street. I love talking about politics. I love talking about town meeting beforehand and afterwards. Nobody's ever asked me. So I think this is a solution to a problem that doesn't really exist.
Mr. Penniman?
Bill Penniman, District 3. My understanding from Wednesday was the only reason that the ballot in the past was done was to satisfy the bond bank. And this is really the only thing we ever do a ballot on as reps. And that we're putting it in the charter now so that we authorize taking a ballot. But it's the necessity of the name on the ballot is a separate issue. If we really need to take these on a ballot that's recordable for the bond bank, it doesn't sound like the bond bank cares whether our name's on it or not. So maybe we should be looking at this just from the standpoint of we will require a ballot and maybe remove the name issue from it. Thank you.
We're talking about Article 13. And Mr. Coram?
Thank you. I think I could be true to my oath as a town meeting rep. I think it's something about being courteous and quiet and peaceable, but still be devious. And, you know, I get the ballot from Annette, put Steve Phillips' name on it, and then Steve votes too, and when Annette goes to count, she's got two Steve Phillips. What's to prevent that? I may be facetious. It may not happen. I would hope it wouldn't. But that's how, if you don't like this, that's the way you get around it, and I think that's creating problems, so I would encourage us to vote against this.
Mr. Underhill.
Thank you, Tim. What about the idea to solve what Dart brought up and Jesse just talked about, having the ballots pre-printed with our name on it or a sticker with our name on it, so we get our own ballot? That would eliminate my voting on some, putting somebody else's name. It would be very easy. You could still sign your name to the ballot like it's asking, but at the bottom of it, it's got my sticker on it, so I know that's my ballot.
Question is on Article 13. Mr. Kopans.
Stuart Kopans, District 3. I remember several years ago, I think, a bond issue with regard to building an expanded fire and police station. And I don't remember how I voted on that. But however I voted, if that was going to be a public record and the police chief could walk in and say, okay, who voted for the bigger police station, it might have had some effect in terms of pushing me to vote for a consolidated police and fire station. And I think there may be times when the issue is not anonymity from the other people in town, but in fact most big bond issues involve town services. And it may be that that if the Planning Commission wants a new whiteboard and computer and we have a bond issue, that will affect how people concerned with what the Planning Commission says votes. So I think the anonymity is not just anonymity from the people who elect us, who are very unlikely to go in and try to figure out how we voted on a particular bond. It's more anonymity in terms of other people.
Questions on Article 13, Mr. Sprite?
I'm wondering how many people here are property owners. You raise your hands? Property owners. Okay. So all of you are paid to vote down the budget. I mean, your taxes go down. If you vote down a zero budget, it's in your interest, right? I mean, anyway, no. I think there are a few pieces of confusion here. One is my understanding from the reason why the paper ballot came up in the first place, and I'd like to differentiate between a paper ballot and an Australian ballot. It happens to be that what we did was an Australian ballot, but as I understand it, the reason for the paper ballot was so that the bond issuer, who I believe is the person whose letter you guys have in hand, right? That's the person who issues our bonds. So he is the one who decides whether we've done due diligence. And that a paper ballot with our name on it, which would, by definition, not be an Australian ballot, but would be a paper ballot for that purpose, would more than meet that requirement. That would be an extra step, so and lead to more confidence. As far as the secret ballot issue goes, as much as I like secret ballots in general, I am strongly persuaded by the idea that we, in fact, are responsible to our constituents and accountable to them, and that we cannot be accountable to them if we vote in secret. So as much as any of us would like to be able to have that freedom in the voting booth in this case, I think it's inappropriate. And so I am persuaded to vote for this. And I don't feel any confusion about the difference between an Australian ballot and a paper ballot in this case. I understand that this is not a place for a secret ballot, but a place for perhaps a paper ballot to satisfy the bond issuer. And if we're willing to stand up in front of the cameras and each other to vote for a variety of different things that we each, may feel strongly about one way or another, at the end of the day, I think we go home with the same mutual respect for each other that we have for years. I think being able to civilly disagree is part of what this is all about in the context of a community. And I appreciate that. I have people I disagree with strongly often, but that doesn't change the fact that I respect their contribution here and their speaking their voice. I think that there's a lot of red herrings in this debate, and we have a lot of, I think, more profound issues to deal with today. So I hope we move on soon.
Question is on Article 13. Are you ready for that question? If so, all in favor of Article 13, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The nays have it. The article is defeated. Article 14. Chair recognizes Mr. Coram.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the town approve the clarifications made to the description of the Finance Committee.
Is there a second? Second. Motion has been made and seconded that the town approve the clarifications made to the description of the Finance Committee. Mr. Bach.
I'd like to call on Commissioner Spunagave to begin the discussion on this question.
I'm sure there will be a question about why do we have a Finance Committee at all. As it happens at the moment, we don't. And we did not last year, but we have had in most of the preceding years. And we considered that, and we decided that whether we had one now or not, for whatever reasons, and there seem to be reasons that this had been written into the charter in the first place, those reasons again may appear, and there would be a time when we really would want a finance committee, and it was wise just to leave it in there so when that time came, it would be easy to reestablish. The reason that we believe it was in there in the first place was to establish somewhat of a check and balance, so that the town meeting members would feel like they have their own set of eyes on the town finances. And so it is in there, and the changes that were made are to expand the purview slightly of the committee when and if it is reestablished, to include not so much just looking at how much money there is and where it is being spent, but the general financial health of the town. And we arrived at this as we thought back 4 or 5 years ago when we were in the throes of what seemed like one financial crisis after another, and none had to do with the budget. And they all had to do with how money was being moved around, how money was lost, and all sorts of other things, but not really how much money there was and how much was spent. And so there's many of these recommendations. All these recommendations actually came originally from our own town finance director, who in his experience in many other places informed us that very typically finance committees look at the town's level of debt, their long-term capitalization plans, and all sorts of stuff like that, some of the financial policy. Thank you.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 14 to make clarifications to the description of the Finance Committee? Mr. Pillsbury.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Well, I'm a strong supporter of this one right here, for a couple reasons. Sitting on the board this year, we didn't have a Finance Committee. It's an open, the budget meetings are open. We had probably 14 or 15 budget meetings. We had maybe 3 people from the public show up. There's 2 reasons why I'm for this. Number one, gives us somebody else other than the board members that are actually there looking this over. And it does help the board members because it's feedback from somebody that's not on the board. I know this is one of them committees, and as a matter of fact, the chair of the board was, I think, a committee of one for a couple of years when I was a town meeting member in the 90s. And I know he would get up at town meeting a lot, bring up a lot of his good points, and then get squashed. And that's why a lot of people don't do this. But it doesn't mean it doesn't go unnoticed or doesn't go unneeded. I believe there's a big need for this. A neighbor of mine who served on this for a long time, he just got frustrated because they'd worked so hard. We now have a committee that's worked 3.5 years on something they really believe in, and so far haven't been getting everything they wanted, and I hope that doesn't discourage them, because this is part of the process. They did their job. They brought it before this body. We all got a say in it. So I'm very much in favor of having a finance committee, and I would love to see some people, you know, get involved in that. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Question is on Article 14. Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor kindly rise and remain standing until counted. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The ayes have it, and you've adopted Article 14. Article 15. Chair recognizes Mrs. O'Connor.
Mr. Moderator, I move that the town approve the clarifications made to the description of the Board of Library Trustees.
Is there a second? Motion has been made and seconded that the town approve the clarification made to the description of the Board of Library Trustees. Chair recognizes Mr. Bach.
Once again, I would like to turn this discussion to be led by Spoonagabe. Oh, I'm sorry, Ronnie Johnson. Sorry, Ronnie.
Okay, mainly this is, as you can see on your sheets, if you have them, we're on page 5 of the green and red thing, clarifications to what it said in the past, so we haven't really made any substantive changes. What's here is what was already there. We did have discussions with the library director and the Board of Trustees in doing this. There's one thing that's slightly different, which is that vacancies shall be filled by the select board, and then what you see in red here, upon recommendation of the library trustees until the next annual representative town meeting. So that's really the only substantive change. The others are just clarifications in the language. I know there's an issue that Barb wants to bring up about something that we didn't change that was already there, and I'll speak again after she's spoken if need be. Thanks.
Question is, shall you adopt Article 15 concerning the library trustees? Are you ready for that question? Ms. Sundag.
One of the things that the Charter Commission did with regard in upcoming votes to discuss with the town clerk and the treasurer is to make them make the chain of command more obvious with regard to that they would be appointed by and then report to the town manager. My concern with this, understanding that there were a couple of changes that were made. It used to say that was the Library Board of Trustees would approve, would employ a librarian. This switched it to a library director, and it also added the words, who will be responsible for executing the same through the library staff. My concern with this is that the Board of Library Trustees, by using the term employee, means that they would be both responsible for hiring and firing the director. That then they would also be, they would own that legal responsibility for doing that, which I think if there were a suit for unfair termination, that it would actually be the Library Board of Trustees individually named. The other issue that I have with this is that the Board of Library Trustees, and I've talked with them on this, is it really takes both the town manager and also the select board out of the employee of the library, so that they would be, and I'm not sure that that makes sense. I think if you want a true chain of command, and you want someone to be responsible, if there are issues with the library, I'd always say if there are issues with the library, do you call the Board of Library Trustees or do you call the town manager? Most people end up calling the town manager. And so I would, I've talked with the chair of the Board of Trustees. I think collaboration and cooperation continue to be of great importance between the select board, the town manager, and the Board of Library Trustees. The same way that collaboration and cooperation is important for the Rec and Parks Board. And so, but I would offer an amendment that would strike the language. I would have the language that is where it says, establish operating procedures and policies for the Brooks Memorial Library and its branches, approve the library budget request to be forwarded to the select board. I would add a period and delete the remainder of that. And that, thus, I would be deleted. The amendment would say to delete and employ a library director who will be responsible for executing the same through a library staff. Then under Article, the new Article 5 of Town Manager, I would add the Town Manager in coordination and collaboration with the Board of Library Trustees shall employ a library director. I think this makes it clear in the charter that that it's a collaborative, it's a collaborative effort. It doesn't diminish, I don't believe, in any way the Board of Library Trustees in their role, but it does make it clear who is responsible for the library director.
Do you have an extra copy of that amendment?
And I don't know, actually, if it makes it easier for that, instead of, because Article 5 hasn't been voted on yet, so it doesn't now yet exist as far as the town manager section, it might make more sense for the amendment, if I might be able to make this, for the additional language, the town manager, just to keep it under the same section, under the Board of Library Trustees. Because otherwise, I guess the amendment would be I'd be requesting something that doesn't yet exist.
Time for a station break.
Okay, Ms. Sundag wishes to make the following amendment. And for those of you who are using the red line, green line booklet, if you look on page 5, under section A, the first 4 sentences in the red will remain up to where it says forwarded to the select board, period. And the following language, and employ a library director who will be responsible for executing the same through a library staff. That would be stricken out. And then the following would be added in lieu of that language: the town manager, in coordination and collaboration with the Board of Library Trustees, shall employ a library director. There has been a second, so the question is, are we going to amend Article 15 as recommended by Ms. Sunday? Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Steve Phillips, District 3. I think this is a really bad idea. I think an employee such as our library director, who's done such a great job, deserves to have one boss, not some vague statement that he or she will be employed by one or two people who may or may not get along, may or may not see eye to eye, who are supposed to collaborate but may not. I think you need one boss, and I think the right boss is the people who work with that library director. So the person who gets employed by the trustees, who works month by month with meetings should be reviewing that person. I think that's just common sense. Second and third, I think it's bad form for the town manager to be proposing this in light of the fact that we've had the discussion about whether you're even entitled to serve as a town meeting member. You certainly were elected, but I think Mr. Bareil's point was whether she should serve. And I don't think we have the answer to that. And the third thing is, it seems to me there's a slight conflict of interest too. You're proposing something for you to have authority, take away authority from the library trustees. I don't think that's right.
The question is on the amendment proposed by Ms. Sunday. Mr. DeGray.
Mr. Moderator, I would like to substitute my name instead of Barb Sontag's name on the motion.
Okay. If there's no objection, we'll consider the motion to have been originally made by Mr. DeGray. Ms. Johnson.
I would like to point out that state statute gives the library board the authority to appoint a library director for the efficient administration and conduct of the library. Now, we have had the present library director for many years, and before that we had another library director for many years. So in most of our memory, we haven't even hired a library director. But in the early 90s, I believe it was, I was on the library board with, I think Christina Gibbons might have been the chairman then. And we did hire Jerry when Mary Morrison left, but Jerry, it wasn't an outside hiring because Jerry was the existing assistant librarian. And we did do that. We did do all the deliberating on that, and we did do the hiring, which was then ratified by whoever the town manager was at the time. So this isn't a change or something revolutionary that's being said here. This is something that has already been happening. And I would also like to say that before we make any amendments of this sort, the library board itself needs to have had time not only to have heard it here, but to have discussed it themselves to see how it works for them. And I would like to call on Elizabeth Tannenbaum, who is a town meeting member and a library board director, to comment on this if she wants.
Ms. Tannenbaum, do you care to make any comments? I assume you do.
Elizabeth Tannenbaum, District 3, and I am on the library board. I don't know whether everybody picked up the yellow sheet that was in the back that does describe the legal statute from the state of Vermont that gives the library board of trustees the power to make library policy. The reality is that we have worked very closely with the select board and with the town manager in doing the evaluation of the librarian and in setting the budget. So it's been a collaborative venture. And so in that respect, I think that we are working well. As Ms. Johnson said, however, who knows what would happen if there is a change in the director and we need to go into hiring. So I think the important thing in the state of Vermont is that the library trustees do have power to set the budget and also to work with hiring and firing the library director. However, I would say that we would want to work collaboratively and we have never done anything different from that.
The question is, shall we amend the article as recommended by Mr. DeGray? Mr. Elwell.
I think we have opened up a real can of worms here, folks, because, and let me give you a little bit of history. The library, or the Brooks Memorial Library was incorporated in, I think, 1884 as a separate Vermont corporation, which exists through today. And I don't know when the town moved in to provide most of the financing, but it was a lot of years ago. And I don't know what the breakdown is today, but I know the town provides a good part of the financing for the library. In most other Vermont towns, the library operates as the library, with a board of directors, and their finances are all handled by the board of directors. The town or the village does not get involved. We've done it differently, and as a result, we've got a hybrid here that has a library board that has statutory authority and functions, and a town that's providing a good part of the financing for the operation. And I will say that over the years, the cooperation has been very, very good. In 1967, we built a new library, and the town was very heavily involved, to the extent of providing the bonds for that library. So I was in the position that Barbara had for a good many years, and I can tell you that if there was a problem at the library, many, many times it wound up on my desk. And it was a go around Robin Hood barn to get back to the director and the library board and to sort it all out. It's not an easy thing to do. And I can understand why the Board of Selectmen are suggesting that maybe they ought to be involved directly in appointing a library director. But it's, as I say, it's not an easy problem to solve, because you've got two different corporations that are separate and have their own authority. But the town is still providing the major amount of the funding, so it's in your lap.
Question is on the amendment proposed by Mr. DeGray. Mr. Webster?
John Webster, District 3. The term that concerned me as I speak here is chain of command. I understand the chain of command. I've been involved in government for a while, both as an administrator and other kinds of ways, and it's important. But there are a few areas where I think it's wise for a body politic to take a little different point of view. Corky has accurately described the relationship. Barbara talks about collaboration. And it usually happens, we've had a wonderful experience here with our people, and the town's very much involved in the library anyway through its budgetary controls and everything else like that. But when it comes to libraries, just like in some cases in education, it's not bad to have a little distance between the governing body and the institution that's providing the service. I can think of the State Board of Education as an example. Every governor I run into always has wanted the State Board of Education to give up authority to appoint the commissioner. And it's been a source of some debate within the legislature and never happened. I remember as a member of the State Board getting a call from a governor who had appointed me suggesting I wasn't behaving properly in terms of recommending what the budget level would be. And sometimes there are issues that need to stay out of the political process. And in this case, hiring a commissioner, I think, is one of those. And I'm not sure that's not applicable here. I'm not concerned about our community turning into Oklahoma, but think what happens sometimes when libraries are controlled by political entities. It does happen. And it seems to me, since it's working pretty well now, and there's pretty good collaboration anyway, I would think that we ought to consider the library different than the Parks Department or the Utility Department or everything else like that. This is a very sensitive area, at least in the area of appointing a director. I prefer to see a little more control by the library board, not by the town. Thank you.
Question is, shall you amend the article as recommended by Mr. DeGray? Mr. Agave?
As has been stated, there are no major changes to the library recommended. And as we have heard, the library itself has not had a chance to mull any of this over. And in fact, and as well, we all know that the library is still running very smoothly, and it's one of the most appreciated places in town. I would like to add that the charter does provide a provision for the select board to propose amendments to the charter itself. And so my recommendation is that we leave the library as it is and allow time for all of the details and philosophical stuff to be thought about and talked about, and at any time in the future, the select board or may come back and ask for a formal change.
So, Spoon, can I just clarify? You say leave it as it is. You mean leave the red type that we've suggested?
Yes, to just leave out the proposals that the commission is recommending are minor. They changed the word librarian to director because, in fact, that's happened long ago.
Mr. Moderator, there's a motion on the floor for the amendment as is.
That's the motion, yes.
So, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Spoon, I don't really hear, an amendment to the amendment, so I'm not.
He's speaking against it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, the question really is on the amendment as proposed by Mr. DeGray. Are you ready for that question? Mr. DeGray.
Yeah. One of the things when you talk about unique relationships, and obviously the library has some strong advocacy here, which is well and good. But to treat it any differently than you treat Public Works, or you treat the rec department, or the town clerk's office, is, I think, not fair to those other departments. I think that we have a budget, and I'm actually not clear, is that what happens when the budget comes forward to us if we don't accept the trustees' budget for the annual budget? Do we send it back to them? The other thing is if the trustees are going to be the employer responsible for the employees, then do we get to take all of those employees off of our town insurance plan, and that the library be responsible for providing those benefits to the library employees? So, as was stated before, unintended consequences of a vote. And we can say we've kind of had this marriage along the way, and it's kind of worked well. Well, part of what's going on here today is if we can clarify some of those gray areas, I think that's what we should do, and that's why I made that motion to clarify what's going on here today. You also have some, when they get audited, there are funds that they have, the trustees have under their control that the town or the board have no control over, which I think is not a good idea. Thank you.
The question is on the Gray amendment. Mr. Copans.
Stuart Copans, District 3. I think Mr. DeGray really shows the fundamental lack of understanding when he acts as if the library is the same as the rec department or the public works department. The library existed, it had an independent existence, and it and the town, in fact, agreed to work together, which they did. But the library still, in fact, has its own charter and is not a department of the town. It is a relationship between the two. And to destroy the library's existence as the kind of institution it has been and continues to be would really drastically, I think, interfere with its function. And as a library trustee, which I've been, you take on certain risks and certain liabilities, and the people who do that knowingly.
Questions on the article proposed by amendment to Mr. DeGray? Mr. Barber.
I'd like to follow up on what Mr. Copan said. There's one area where the library is like no other town department, and that is that it is a repository of information, and it's also a vehicle to acquire information. And I think it would be a terrible mistake to dissolve the separation between the ability to acquire information and the general government. This is a small town. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody trusts everybody. But nonetheless, there are places where government has really no business.
Question is on the DeGray amendment. Ms. Manning?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. It seems to me that maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I believe the amendment had the language in here about that the town manager, in coordination and collaboration with the Board of Library Trustees. That's the language that I heard, and yet a lot of people are talking about chain of command and being in control, and I don't hear that in the amendment. So I understand there are other issues at play, but there has been collaboration all along. So I understand that there are gray issues here, but it seems that the spirit of the wording in this amendment is in collaboration and coordination. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Question is on the amendment as proposed by Mr. DeGray. Are there any other questions? Mr. Cook.
Hillary Cook, District 3. Just to follow up on Ms. Manning's comments, Mr. Moderator, could you read one more time the amendment that's on the floor?
Yes.
The proposed amendment?
Yes. Now we're on page 4 of those of you who have the red line, green line. I'm sorry, page 5. Red line, green line. We're under A, and the red line now reads, establish the operating procedures and policy for the Brooks Memorial Library and its branches, approve the library budget request to be forwarded to the select board, and then you'd put a period, and you would strike out the remaining language, which is, and employ a library director who will be responsible for executing the same through a library staff. Instead, you would substitute for that language that has been stricken, the town manager, in coordination and collaboration with the Board of Library Trustees, shall employ a library director. Any other questions? Mr. Wilberding?
John Wilberding, District 3. I stand to speak against this proposed amendment and for the question overall, because I believe that the intention of the drafters was to encourage the continuance of a very strong nonprofit educational institution in our community, which the library is now. And it was established as such, and I think it should remain such. And it's good organization science to let the Board of Trustees replenish its own number and hire and supervise their own director.
Question is on the DeGray amendment to Article 15. Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The amendment. This is the amendment. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing until counted. The amendment is defeated. So the recurring question is, shall you adopt Article 15 with respect to the town's Board of Library Trustees? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Please stand. Thank you. Those opposed, kindly rise and remain standing. The ayes have it, and you've adopted Article 15. Article 16.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I move that the town preclude any board, committee, or commission member from participating in any discussion where a conflict of interest is asserted unless agreed upon to an open vote in public session by a majority of the remaining fellow members.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion has been made and seconded that the town preclude any board, committee, or commission member from participating in any discussion where a conflict of interest is asserted unless agreed to in an open vote given in public session by a majority of the remaining fellow members. Mr. Block.
There are two changes suggested here. Already in our existing charter, there is a prohibition against any town or town school district board, commission, or committee member from voting on any matter where there is a direct or indirect financial or any direct or indirect personal interest without the consent of the majority of fellow board, commission, and committee members given in public session. This adds another layer to that, and that is the participation in a discussion on such an issue where a conflict of interest exists. It is still subject to being overridden by the remaining members of that board, commission, or committee by a majority vote given on an affirmative question, which, to translate that, let me use the select board as an example. If it is understood that there's a conflict of interest by one member of the current select board, and there are 4 remaining members, and the question is, shall that person be permitted to discuss, to participate in the discussion? In order for that to happen, 3 members out of the remaining 4 would have to vote affirmatively, for a 2-2 vote would not carry the motion. That is essentially the end of this new language here, explains that in its very wording. Shall, quote, member with conflict be allowed to participate in the discussion and vote on the issue at hand. So it gives an extra weight to more than a 50-50 vote in order for that person with a conflict to participate in the discussion. So that is essentially the change from the existing charter, which already prohibits the voting on such a matter.
Question is on Article 16. Ms. Erfer?
Kathy Erfer, District 1. I'm going to propose a language change, and before I do that, I wanted to just speak a little bit about my concerns and some of the things I discovered over the past couple days while researching this. So initially, when I saw this conflict of interest, I was really perplexed at the language, because to me, it seems that it develops a culture of tacit approval for someone with a conflict of interest to participate in and or vote on an issue at hand when they have a conflict. And at a very basic kind of core level, that strikes me as completely unethical. I understand the committee's role in this is really making a somewhat minor adjustment from the language that is already existing. So my issue is not necessarily with the revision, it's with both. Because I think that the language is woefully inadequate. So initially, I attempted to rewrite the language and then realized that I probably should go research to see, what kind of conflict of interest policies exist and what they say. And what I found is that, in fact, the state, there's a state statute that allows for the select board to pass a conflict of interest policy, but the passage of that policy is much more comprehensive than even what I am about to propose. So I also went to the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and found that they have a conflict of interest policy, which is 3 pages long, which includes definitions, includes a disqualification section, which, a few quotes, public office shall not participate in any official action if he or she has a conflict of interest in the matter under consideration, period. In the case of a public officer who is an appointee, the public body which appointed that public officer shall have the authority to order that officer to recuse him or herself from the matter. Public officers shall not use resources not available to the general public, including but not limited to town staff time, equipment, supplies, or facilities for private gain or personal purposes. There's many other very pointed examples here. There's a section on disclosure, which basically says that it is expected that the person will disclose their conflict of interest, and it states in the end, nevertheless, the person or public body which appointed that public officer retains the authority to order that officer to recuse him or herself from the matter. There's an entire section on recusal. Any person may request that a member recuse him or herself due to a conflict of interest. Such request shall not constitute a requirement that the member recuse him or herself. And there's an entire section on enforcement. So to me, that's a pretty comprehensive policy. And in my fantasy world, this would be something we would be adopting. Or, as the state statutes kind of imply, that the select board either pass a policy or an ordinance stating this to apply to everyone in the town. Since we don't have that, and we do have this question of this conflict of interest statement in our charter, I feel at the very least the language should reflect the intention of the law. And with that in mind, and I just want to say two more things before I state this language. One of the things that struck me as one of the committee members, when I asked about this on Wednesday night, said that they included participation with the vote because in certain committees we might have a small group where one of the committee members, even though they have a conflict of interest, also has a great deal of information that can be added to the discussion. And I think that that's valid. So I wanted to acknowledge that in the language. And so the language I'm proposing to replace what would be Section 9, conflict of interest, is the following. No member of any town or town school district board, commission, or committee shall vote on any matter where there is a direct or indirect financial or personal interest. It is expected that any member of any town or town school district board, commission, or committee with a conflict of interest will fully disclose the nature of their conflict and will recuse him or herself from a vote on the issue at hand. The member with a conflict of interest may participate in the discussion of the issue at hand with the consent of the majority of the remaining board, commission, or committee members. Any interested person may publicly request that a member recuse him or herself due to a conflict of interest. So I respectfully request that the body consider that language change as appropriate for this charter.
There is a second. So the proposal is as follows. No member of any town or town school board, commission, or committee shall vote on any matter where there is a direct or indirect financial or personal interest. It is expected that any member of any town or town school district board, commission, or committee with a conflict of interest will fully disclose the nature of their conflict and will recuse him or herself from a vote on the issue at hand. The member with the conflict of interest may participate in the discussion of the issue at hand with the consent of the majority of the remaining board, commission, or committee members. Any interested person may publicly request that a member recuse him or herself due to a conflict of interest. So the question now is, shall you amend Article 16 by the Urfer Amendment? Mr. Block.
I'd like to comment on Kathy's amendment. First of all, what we had recommended raises the bar, raises the standard, not lowers it. It almost seemed like you implied that we lowered it. We actually raised the requirements for a person with a conflict of interest to vote or participate in a discussion. Second of all, your amendment actually lowers the standard, not raises it, because by not adding the language that we have suggested, which is, quote, shall fill in member with conflict be allowed to participate in the discussion and vote on the issue at hand, that question is an affirmative-based question requiring a majority of the remaining board to decide, meaning on a board that has 4 or an even number of remaining members, you must have a 3-to-1 vote to permit the discussion or the vote. If you don't put in that language, someone can make a motion in the negative, and a failing vote in the negative would allow the participation in the vote or the vote itself to be passed by an evenly divided board. So it is essential, and this is advice we received from town attorney, that if you want to raise the standard, you have to maintain this language at the end as to how procedurally a vote by the remaining board members shall be brought forth.
Ms. Server?
I just want to respond. There's a distinction between voting and discussion. And this states clearly that if there is a conflict of interest, the member cannot vote, period. And if the majority decides it's okay, the member can be included in the conversation. So I don't really see how that would be lowering the bar. I feel like.
Can I just clarify that if it was, let's just limit it to the participation in the discussion. It's a 5-member board, and one member is not going to participate in the question, the vote, to allow or not allow a participation in discussion. If the motion is made by one of the remaining board members, that in the negative, and I'd ask maybe, Bob, would you explain this? I'm not getting this across right. If the vote is put forth, the question is put forth in the negative, to carry the question does not require a majority.
Mr. Fisher is interrogated.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. With regard to the question of voting on it, and I'm speaking more to what is recommended by the Charter Commission, not to your language in the amendment, but who makes the motion and how it's phrased has an impact when it's going in a 5-member board. The vote is by the remaining board members. So a 2-to-2 vote fails. So if somebody moves that somebody should not be able to vote and it's 2-to-2, that fails and the person can vote. So generally speaking, we like motions to be in the positive And that way, to allow somebody to vote, the majority of the fellow board members in a 4-4 would be a 3-to-1 vote would be required. That's obviously different for a board that has 7 or 9, etc. So I guess another way to say that is the Charter Commission wanted to, and correct me if I have your intent wrong, but to highlight that there should be a provision in the charter regarding conflict of interest. And number 2, they struggled with whether or not how it's voted on is somebody using that conflict of interest as a sword or as a shield. And not sure how that's going to come out. But they wanted to keep it being a motion of the fellow board members as compared to going beyond the board. It's got to stay with the board because the board is making that decision, or committee or commission, etc.
Mr. Eaton?
Mel Eaton, First District. I'd like to have the last sentence of Kathy's proposal read again, because the way I think I heard it, she says at that point, if anybody raises an objection, that will bar participation by the person supposedly with a conflict of interest.
It states, any interested person may publicly request that a member recuse him or herself due to a conflict of interest.
Can request it, but it's not if they raise the subject, they are barred.
Questions on the Erffer Amendment? Mr. Corum.
I guess I would interrogate the members of the commission. Is there any reason that a simple reference to the state statutes that Kathy referenced could not cover this situation, the conflict situation?
I believe, I believe because the charter is not specific to conflict of interest standards, that the statute prevails here. This does not in any way establish a criteria for conflict of interest. It only gives a remedy for the board, once there is the establishment of a conflict of interest, to recognize that there are certain situations where a conflict may not be sufficient to bar a discussion and or a vote. But this does not in any way prohibit the statute from being operative, because it is not specific to what it is establishes a conflict of interest.
Question is on the article as proposed. Ms. Boulos.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'd like to suggest a friendly amendment to the amendment, and that is that we take the language that Ms. Erffer has suggested and we make it a paragraph before the next paragraph, and then just strike out the language vote on or, and so then then you have participate in a discussion and you have the whole voting and the language that you use, and it would work.
Could you repeat that again, please?
Well, just take the language that she suggested, make it a paragraph above their language, and then take out the words shall vote, take out the words vote on or, and so then it will read, no member of any town or school district, board, commission, or committee shall participate in any discussion of any matter where there's direct, and you just leave everything the way it is.
Now, I'm looking now on page 5, section 9, conflict of interest. And are you then suggesting that the recommendation of Ms. Erfer, we would just put that whole paragraph in. Then we would go back to the book and put that paragraph in.
That, I think, is like.
Minus the vote. Minus the voting on it.
Minus the voting.
Right, just the part of discussion.
You were being interrogated.
I mean, oh, okay, sorry. Okay,
All right, now let me make sure we're all on the same page here. I'm looking at page 5, section 9, conflict of interest. As I understand it, you want to put Ms. Erfer's paragraph first, and then you want to put the second paragraph that's printed in the book on page 7. And why don't you read both of those so we can all be sure that together, so we are all sure we're.
Vote on or.
and actually, to make it clear, I think actually to revise it, because some of it's redundant now. So you read it, no member of any town or town school district board, commission, or committee shall vote on any matter where there is a direct or indirect financial or personal interest. It is expected that any member of any town or town school district board, commission, or committee with a conflict of interest will fully disclose the nature of their conflict and will recuse him or herself from a vote on the issue at hand. Then you go down to the next thing and you say no member of any town or town school district board, commission, or committee shall participate in any discussion of any matter where there is a direct or indirect financial interest on any without the direct financial interest or any direct or indirect personal interest without the consent by an open vote given the public session of the majority of the remaining fellow board, commission, or committee members using the following motions. Shall a member with conflict be allowed to participate in the discussion and vote on the issue at hand? And then you can take the last sentence of Kathy's thing and say any interested person can publicly request that a member recuse him or herself due to a conflict of interest.
So you're actually going to omit one sentence in the proposed amendment.
Yes. What? The last sentence, yes, would go at the end.
Well, I didn't hear you read this sentence. Okay? The member with the conflict of interest may participate in the discussion of the interest at hand and with the consent of the majority of the remaining board, the commission, or committee members.
Yes, that's right. I struck that because it's redundant.
Okay, I'm just trying to clarify it. You know, it's difficult with me having this to figure out what's going on, to be honest with you.
Have you written that down?
I can.
Yeah, that would be.
Okay, let me just read it again so we can make sure we all understand it. We're going to start now with the amendment as proposed by Ms. Erfer. No member of any town or town school district board, commission, or committee shall vote on any matter where there is a direct or indirect financial or personal interest. It is expected that any member of any town or town school district, commission, or committee with a conflict will fully disclose the nature of their conflict and will recuse him or herself from the vote on the issue at hand. And that's it for right now. Then we go to conflicts of interest in the book on page 7. I'm sorry, page 5. And it reads, no member of any town or town school district, commission, or committee shall vote or participate in any discussion of any matter where there is a direct or indirect financial interest or any direct or indirect personal interest without the consent by an open vote given in public session of the majority of the remaining fellow board, commission, or commission members using the following motion. Shall, then member with conflict be allowed to participate in the discussion and vote on the issue at hand. Then we go back to Ms. Erfers and add any interested person may publicly request that a member recuse him or herself due to a conflict of interest.
3 words that you needed to strike from that second paragraph would be vote on or. Second paragraph.
And in the last sentence of that paragraph, the word vote on.
Okay. I think we got to get Ms. Boubulis to come up here.
Well, I'm glad we are coming back. It's in the new Was it, were you here the last, one after the charter?
Yes. 15 years ago? Yeah.
Were you here the last, did it go same kind of way?
Okay.
You know, it's really an exercise in wits. Right. That is good. I've never spent this kind of time with
There is one mistake that I made, and that is if you look on page 5, conflict of interest, it's going to read as follows. There's a change in the second sentence, or the second line. It's going to read, no member of any town or town school district, board, commission, or committee shall participate. So we're going to take out the words vote on or. And then that remaining paragraph in its entirety is included. And then the last sentence of Ms. Erfer's amendment, any interested person may publicly request that a member recuse him or herself due to a conflict of interest, is to be included. Now, Mr. Wheelock.
Mr. Wheelock, District 2. I think we also, in the second time through, Tim, I think on the next to the last line, the 2 end words, and vote on the issue at hand, the end vote should also come out. Because her amendment establishes they will not be allowed to vote on the issue, and by coming with this speaking on the discussion part, we want to vote to have them allowed in the discussion, but not vote on it.
Yes. Accept that.
So that's on page 5, and it would read, shall, then in parentheses, member with conflict be allowed to participate in the discussion, and then strike out and vote on. So it's limiting it to participating in the discussion but not voting on it. Okay, does everybody have a sense?
Mr. Moderator, I'm very sorry, okay? I want to just know, they now have to have permission to even be part of the conversation, am I correct? Okay, thank you.
Okay, does everybody have an understanding of where we are at this point? Okay, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm just confused that the last part, that shall member with the conflict be allowed to participate in the discussion. My understanding is we're talking about striking and vote on the issue. My understanding...
And vote on.
So you're taking and vote on out?
Yes.
On the issue at hand. Dropping just and vote. The amendment says they're not going to be allowed to vote. Then, following most of the amendment, this paragraph is put in to indicate that if the remaining majority of the remaining portion of the board votes in the affirmative, they will be allowed to participate in the discussion. If you leave and vote in, you're obviating the effect of the first part.
So my question then is, who determines whether or not that member of the board has the conflict that disqualifies that person from voting?
This never spoke to that.
Well, yes, it did. That's the whole purpose.
It never spoke to determining what the conflict of interest was, as was pointed out for us. We were told that's covered by state statute.
No, the state statute that Ms. Erfer spoke about enables the select board to draft and pass conflict of interest policies for the town, okay? And that's perfectly fine. What I'm getting at is that this language in quotations was to be the language of the motion to decide whether a fellow board member can vote if indeed if they perceive a conflict and the remaining fellow board members say, well, we still think you can vote on that, that would be the language of the motion to enable that person to vote. And if the majority of the fellow board members allow that person to vote, then fine, it's not that big of a conflict of interest that would warrant anything. At least it's raised.
It's my understanding that for this amendment, we're going to be using Ms. Erfurt's amendment to say that first paragraph says they will not be allowed to vote, period.
Okay. My question is, who determines whether or not they're allowed to vote? Who determines the level of the conflict?
That's what we're voting on, though. Her amendment does not speak to that. It just says they will not be allowed to vote. This paragraph then becomes a discussion about who's allowed into the discussion. That's why it should not contain the vote, the references to voting within that paragraph.
We're talking about the amendment.
Okay, but assuming this amendment passes, okay, I still then ask the question, who determines whether a board member, who determines the conflict? I don't have it clear in my mind as to who's making that. What?
Well, I think what we're going to do, because there's too much uncertainty by everybody, we're going to take a 5-minute recess. Anybody who's interested in this proposal, I know Mr. Harvey's got another amendment. I want all of you to come up here and we can visit and try to figure this out. Can I have your attention, please? If I can have your attention, please. Basically, we're at a point where the conflict of interest matter can be resolved. The parties who are interested in the various amendments are going to get together this week. It's been decided, and the Charter Committee feels that the process has gone well today, but maybe it would be better, because we aren't going to finish everything. Our signers for the deaf and hard to hearing and impaired people have to leave at 5:30. Our communications people got to leave at 5:30. So maybe looking at the tea leaves, it's better for us to leave right now ourselves. So this is the plan, subject to your approval, that we would, in effect, we would continue our action on Article 16 until next Saturday, the 29th of January, to be the first order of business, commencing at 8:30 at this location. Well, you have a conflict. What? The question is, I think it appears that the interest now is to make the meeting Saturday, February 5th, commencing at 8:30. And so we would basically adjourn now, subject to any announcements.
I just wondered if you could get a show of hands about whether people are going to be able to come.
How many folks could make it on Saturday, February 5th? Almost a majority of here, and I'm wondering even if we got a quorum right now. But, so I think the consensus is that we come back Saturday, February 5th at 8:30. And I'm going to recognize Jerry for an announcement.
I just wanted to state that I'll be out in the hallway with this petition for a referendum on what was a pretty close vote to increase the size of the select board to 7 members, which was voted down 53 to 43 here. I think it was close enough to allow the citizens of Brattleboro, the voters, on March 1st to consider this question along with the expanded terms of that office. There are two separate petitions, and I and a couple other members of the commission will be outside this room asking for your signature if you would support having such a referendum, whether or not you voted yes or no on the question as to whether you think it's reasonable that the voters of the town be able to weigh in on this important question. Thank you.
Mr. Dines?
Yes, sir. Do you require a motion before recess?
Well,
not adjournment, but recess?
Yes, we're going to have a motion for recess. You care to make it?
I care to make that motion.
So moved. Seconded. Any other comments, ideas?
Thank you.
All in favor of recessing to February 5th, signify. Yes.